Okay, Bismillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another episode of the Fatherhood podcast. And today, this one wasn't streamed live on Instagram. Some of them we do, some of them we don't. So you'll be seeing this a little bit later. But if you do want to join into some of the podcasts at another point when maybe we are doing it live, then do make sure you follow the links that you may find for my Instagram. And also, like I've been saying in some previous episodes, alhamdulillah, I've had some help from the nursery that my children attend to put together some of these videos. So again, I'm going to include their link in the description. And if your children are looking to attend a nursery and you're around this sort of Waterford area like I am, then you can check out their website and their Instagram. So those things out of the way, today, alhamdulillah, we have an amazing guest with us, a conversation that I'm very much looking forward to, which is our brother Alim Sheikh, who is the head teacher at Barnet Hill Academy, which at the moment is an independent fee-paying school, and that may be changing, and that's something that we, inshallah, will be speaking about. So those of you who are interested in education, interested in Islamic schooling, interested in all things teacher, school, Muslim education related, then this is definitely the podcast to be listening to. So, assalamu alaikum, Sheikh Alim Sheikh. How are you doing?
Alhamdulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How are you?
Good, alhamdulillah, I'm doing well. So usually my guests, they don't know the format of this, but you, mashallah, have done your homework and you know what's coming next. So the first question that we ask all of our guests is, how old were you when you became a father, and how many children do you have?
Okay, so being a teacher, of course, I had to do my homework to learn a little bit more about the show beforehand. So I was 25 years old when I married, and I have 3 children, alhamdulillah, 3 boys. 2 of my boys are still with us, and 1 is with our Rabb, alhamdulillah.
Okay, alhamdulillah. Great, alhamdulillah, that's amazing. So 25 years old, that seems like it's sort of the normal age, I would say, that many sort of Muslim couples start to get married around the mid-20s. Did you go into that thinking, I'm going to get married around that age, have this vision? What was it like for yourself?
So I married at 25 purely because I wanted to follow in the tradition of our Prophet, peace be upon him.
Yeah.
I was keen. Obviously, we understand that marriage is half of our deen, and we understand that one should endeavour to follow the traditions of our Prophet, peace be upon him. So that was my intention and my goal. And I was 28. I think your next question is, what age did I have children at? So I was 28 when I had my first child. Right. So that was the intention behind getting married at 25.
Okay, alhamdulillah. Do you remember the first time you became a father? What was the experience like?
Yes. It was a wonderful experience. Quite a strange time in terms of work, because I had left one job and migrated, and then left another job and migrated. And I had found myself back in Scotland.
Yeah, if you can't tell from the accent.
I had found myself back in Scotland, and I was in a sort of a temporary advisory role at the time. And because of the nature of that role, I decided to do Hajj. I was able to do Hajj, and so I did Hajj.
Okay.
And Hajj at that time was in March. Obviously, it was a long time ago. And the idea was that I completed my Hajj on my own with the group that I was going with, and that when I returned 2 or 3 weeks later, that our son would be born. And such are our best laid plans, but Allah is, of course, the best of planners. And whilst I was on Hajj in Medina, after the Hajj, doing our ziyarat and what have you, that was when my son was actually born.
Wow. SubhanAllah.
And I wasn't aware that he was born premature.
Okay.
So
you,
it was only
you
when...
had thought, like, once you've gone for this trip, that you'll come back and there'll still be a few weeks left and you'll be part of that whole process.
Yeah, that my Hajj would be complete.
Yeah.
That then, obviously we would have our son and so on and so forth. So I was in Medina, and I remember I was actually quite troubled, even during some of my salah in the Prophet's mosque. And there were just things and thoughts, and little did I know that at that precise moment in time, what the cause of those possible sort of thoughts or things that were going through my mind were. It was only when I returned to London, to the airport, as I was catching the flight, flying back up to Scotland, that my family told me that my son had been born.
SubhanAllah. So you weren't even aware, but it was just this feeling inside of you. SubhanAllah. That's amazing. And do you remember those first sort of maybe the first year or two? Was fatherhood like a very new concept to you, or did you feel prepared? Did you have maybe younger siblings or nieces, nephews around in the household that just it kind of felt like, this is I know this off the back of my hand?
I think I don't think it was entirely new to me. I've been in education my entire life,
right,
in one form or fashion. So I've been around children. I graduated, became a teacher immediately, and my son was born quite soon after I became a teacher. So I'd always been around children and young people, in and out of schools, whichever kind of work I was doing in education. Plus, we had the benefit, like you say, of lots of family, very traditional, if you like, Pakistani family. And my parents had the privilege at that time of having one granddaughter or grandson for a period of, I think, 10 or 11 years consecutively.
Right.
So there were a few nieces and nephews before, and then there were a few nephews and nieces after, one for every year during that period.
MashaAllah. Okay, so there's definitely a lot of sort of chances for you to get stuck into sort of father roles and things like that. Alhamdulillah. Okay, that's good.
We were living in, again, one of those traditional multi-generational homes.
Yeah.
So grandparents, children, grandchildren, all in one home. So we were very blessed in that respect.
Did you find that came to you and your wife's advantage when it came to parenting, being in such a household? Because nowadays it's becoming less and less common for younger parents to do that. In fact, like even for myself, I made the decision to move out of the home and find my own place to raise my family. And I think that comes with its benefits, but I also see the benefits of being in the generational home. And it'll be interesting to, I'm therefore maybe from a complete different generation to yourself. So the way that the parenting works, it's interesting to see the differences in the dynamic. How did you feel being part of that? Do you think it was to your advantage?
I think what you may find is that depending upon whom you ask, there are different answers to that question.
Yeah.
So whether you ask the father, and whether the father is living with his parents, or whether, as is probably less common, you ask the mother and you're living with the mother's parents, of course you'll have a different answer. So that's one aspect. If you leave that aspect aside, My experience was one where we were sandwiched between both. So prior to living in the multi-generational home with my parents, we had spent a little bit of time on our own independently. And soon after our son was born, we had to move out, primarily for work reasons. So, I've had the privilege of both experiences. And as usual is the way with these things, there's pros and cons with both. I think it's important that those young couples have an opportunity to find their own feet independently and get to know one another. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges, and from what I gather, that's one of the main reasons that many young couples choose to move out and find their independence, strike on their own, and so on and so forth. Obviously, that has great benefits, but there's certainly a lot of benefit in living with one's peers, not just parents, but also elder siblings or younger siblings, and also with grandparents. It has its drawbacks, of course. What I find is that often grandparents, and I'm not saying this is for every parent, but sometimes those younger couples find grandparents can be interfering, of course. That their parenting skills, their parenting approaches are being forced upon their children. So those are sort of some of the reasons why it's beneficial maybe not to be around. But then again, there's a huge amount of wealth and tradition and understanding and knowledge and support that those grandparents can offer. And I think it boils down to a very individual experience. What I would say is that striking out independently, there are skills that parents don't acquire when they are on their own. And there's a great deal that one can learn from one's elders, of course.
Definitely. I know, I agree with you. I think if you completely remove yourself from the picture with the grandparents, and the uncles, the aunties, and things like that, you're losing a lot. And a lot of parenting comes from the direct learning and experience of others rather than reading through books. In fact, I had a friend on this podcast before who compared parenting books to books about swimming. That it's only until you actually try and you get into the deep waters and you work with somebody who's been there and done that, do you really gain the fruits. But if you're just reading and listening to podcasts like this and not actually, being in the trenches and learning off those who are more experienced, then you're definitely going to be losing out a big part of your parenting.
Well, I think if we reflect upon it, parenting is a skill. And skills are rarely learned through books. And if we reflect, I mean, you used the word earlier on that I come from a slightly different generation, of course. If you look at it over the ages, over the past 1-2 generations, if I were to look at parents today, and as I say, I've been involved in education now for almost 30 years. One of the biggest challenges we have in education in schools is actually around parenting skills and the ability of parents to parent. So I think there is more that has been lost than gained through that divorce of family tradition, strong family culture, family bonds, and having grandparents around, not even living with, but just even around.
How long have you been outside of Scotland? Are you in London? This is going to lead to another question.
So outside of London, I have basically 25 years. So I left as soon as I had qualified as a teacher, but then I have had 1 or 2 short episodes a couple of years back in Scotland.
Now, the question is sort of, do you see there being any sort of difference between raising Muslim children in Scotland versus other parts of the UK in your experience?
I grew up in Glasgow.
Yeah.
And I've spent most of my adult life in post-education in London, or the vast majority. Other cities and countries also, but the vast majority in London. And Glasgow doesn't have a very good reputation, unfortunately, in terms of some of the societal aspects. There's a strong undercurrent of deprivation, you could say.
Right.
It has one of the highest teenage births in all of Europe.
Wow.
Pretty much consistently. There has been periods where it's lost that crown, but it has regained. And of course, that's a means of deprivation for many of those young, or many of those young girls find it as a means of a way out of deprivation or a cycle. I'm not saying that is the case, but that's how they perceive it.
Yeah.
It does have its own drugs problems, and also, a degree of employment, unemployment, and so on and so forth. So it has its fair share of problems in some respects. I'm sure there's many politicians that would disagree with me and say all the positive things that Glasgow has, and it has very many positive things. But in short, what I'm saying is that growing up in a place such as London, or a city such as Glasgow, or a country such as Scotland, which has a population of 5 million, and a country such as England, where London alone has about 15 million population. They're two quite different things and experiences, and society has a big bearing upon how one is brought up. In general terms, much more relaxed, much more laid back, much more unrelenting. London is a much more unrelenting place than places like Scotland or Glasgow. And of course, those things bring their own challenges, the deprivation and the pace of life, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. I think I wanted to ask that because obviously I've never had somebody who's lived there and grown up in Scotland, and there is a lot of conversation about moving to different parts of the UK or moving abroad, and it's very much to do. The reasons are, maybe the reasons used to be more to do with economic reasons, and I think the reasons are now becoming a lot more to do with parenting, more, social issues, moral issues, and things like this. So, just seeing there's a significant difference between England and Scotland. There would be a lot of differences also going further abroad, and these are the types of things that people, I guess, they should be considering. How different it would be. Thinking that okay, maybe the grass is greener on the other side, but you don't really know. You don't, and how much difference is just between England and Scotland can show you how much a difference there may be elsewhere, and making those decisions very carefully on where your children will be raised and what you think is actually a better environment for your children and what is not. Which I guess it brings me, because you said that your part of maybe your career in education brought you to other parts of the world. So what got you into career in the first place, and where have you into that career, and where have you traveled when it comes to your teaching?
I think I've been in, as say, education. I trained in the mid-90s, early 90s. I think I qualified in 94 or 95. Yeah. So I qualified as an English teacher then. And there was a time, I'm not so sure it's so much the case today, but there was a time, a long time, in education and in the teaching profession where one would hear that it was a teacher who inspired you to become a teacher. And I think there was a couple of things that led me to become a teacher. I was always interested in the arts, and I studied philosophy and English as an undergraduate at Glasgow University, and that was what grabbed me. I enjoyed reading, I enjoyed literature,
Right.
and I enjoyed philosophy, thinking and reading about the world and the world around us. And so stepping into teaching was almost natural, but I suppose if you add 2 or 3 elements, that opportunity to read and write and think, and also I happened to go to what at the time, the school no longer exists, but it was the worst. It was nominated the worst school in the East End of Glasgow. But the teachers were wonderful.
Right.
And I happened to have an English teacher who I recall just invested in me as the son of an immigrant, growing up in the 70s and 80s in the East End of Glasgow, having a white English teacher, taking you under her wing and teaching you English. These are the kind of things that memories are made of. So I think way back in the sort of in those times when things were very stark, in my secondary schooling in the East End of Glasgow, there were no other non-white people,
Asians,
non-Asian or non-black or BAME people.
Right.
So having those kinds of experiences where teachers really invested in you, then going through the system, finding your feet at university, reading and writing, I think it was almost a very natural progression. And when the thought came to me, it was almost like some form of wahi, It was, I want to become a teacher. So I went to teacher training college.
Right, okay.
And lo and behold, I found the same situation. I was the only non-white teacher training to become a teacher.
Wow.
During that period, and went through the system and qualified to become a teacher. Did
you find that difficult being the only non-white? Were you treated differently due to your race, or did you find that actually,
no.
it was just, maybe did you yourself feel awkward and there was actually no discrimination there?
No, and I think that's one of the good things about the teaching profession. I didn't at all. And your earlier question about growing up in Scotland, should one make that kind of transition? Certainly Scotland, if you've ever been, you'll find it a very friendly place.
I hope to visit.
Warm.
I haven't yet.
Inshallah, we'll take you one day.
Inshallah.
So if people are very warm, they're very friendly. Of course, in those periods, again, more societally, I would say, than perhaps to do with the people, there were a lot of difficulties growing up as a person of colour during, during those political times.
Sure.
But going through university, going through teacher training, absolutely not. Even although I was the only person, not only at that particular university, teacher training in the early 90s, mid 90s, there were no BAME people, certainly, or very, very few who were going through the system as qualified teachers.
Okay.
But I found it a very welcoming place. And I recall one experience where I went to do when I was doing my teacher training in communities that were entirely white at that time. So small towns, villages almost as well, sometimes outside of Glasgow. And when I asked for the key when I asked for a prayer facility.
Yeah.
So my stance was very much, I'm a teacher, I'm Muslim, I need to pray every day.
Yes.
And when you're doing your 6 or 8 week or 12-week placement in a school, you have to do 3 placements in a year. Of course, I had to make sure that I had the facility to pray. So my experience was extremely positive. In one school, where it was a village, no BAME people whatsoever. I asked for the facility, and I was given the key for the main school's conference room.
Yeah.
So they treated me in such a positive way that those experiences were all really positive. So, having the keys to the school's conference room every day, whenever I wanted it, just to do my salah, was the kind of respect that I received during those times.
Alhamdulillah, that's really good to hear. Being a teacher is obviously very difficult. It's very well known, and most teachers stay in the profession not for the money, but because of the love of the profession itself. And therefore, it's obviously quite rare to see many people take up the profession to a much higher level, which you have done, which is going up and becoming a head teacher and teaching at multiple schools and abroad as well. So why what drove you to sort of take the profession further, given that it's generally quite difficult?
Okay, so sorry, I realised that when you just said abroad as well, I didn't answer the second part of your earlier question. So just briefly, my educational experiences have taken me from as far north as Inverness. I visited schools, Gordonston School. I've been there a few times. I haven't taught there, but visited. Under different guises, sometimes as an advisor, consultancy roles, advisory roles, teaching, etc., etc. So as far north as Inverness, in England, as far south as the Isle of Wight, more broadly, as far south as Melbourne.
Wow.
And as far east as Beijing, and as far west as Chicago.
Wow.
and a few places obviously in between, but those are the extremities. So across Europe, France, Germany, Italy, I visited on for different reasons. Africa, Nigeria, I've done some work in the Gulf, also Pakistan, etc. So the experience has been quite wholesome. It's been quite broad in that respect. Right. And in terms of what has I think you asked, driven me on?
Yeah, to kind of go up the ranks and stay in the profession, go up to taking more responsibilities as a head teacher. I mean, already being just a teacher of a classroom is very, very difficult. So why put yourself through the paces?
I always encourage my own children and other children to follow their passions. And education, and that's a very broad word, but developing and helping young people to grow, for me, it's a passion. It's something that I'm committed to. And when I entered the profession, I was very keen to excel and to teach. And when I started to become good at teaching, I wanted to do a bit more. So I wanted to start to train other teachers, and I started to engage with that. And I worked in advisory roles, and I worked for local authorities. And then I started to develop that. When I started to become good at teacher training, I wanted to sort of share my skills and expertise a bit further. So I started to write. And I went into academia, and I started to do some research. And so the cycle just, we just continue. If we want to progress, we keep pitching higher in terms of the path. I'm not very much a career person, but of course, if you want to make a broader impact upon things, you push yourself and you develop yourself further, and that traction just built and it built and it built over time. So I started doing teacher training, I started doing writing, started publishing, I started doing consultancy work, and I've kind of done things back to front. A lot of people go through the school system and they become a head of department and then become a senior leader and then they become a head teacher and so on and so forth, and then they go into consultancy.
Yeah.
I did it the other way around. So I've started to manage and lead schools towards the latter part of my career. So I'm now a head teacher, but I have those other skill sets. And now I'm enjoying leading schools. I lead, obviously, this school where I am presently, but I also lead another Islamic faith school. And I've helped to establish 3 or 4 Islamic faith schools during my time as well.
Okay, alhamdulillah. Which I guess brings me on to the next question is, why are the Islamic faith schools so important to you? There's many Muslim teachers that are just working in state schools, in public schools, and you've chosen to now take your career through that route. What is that? What makes you want to do that?
Well, I haven't actually. My very first role was helping to establish an Islamic faith school.
Okay.
So after graduating as a teacher, my very first role was to help establish a school that's still going, alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. So the passion's been there since the beginning.
I've never really seen it as a passion for Islamic faith schools.
Okay.
As I say, I didn't quite say that. What I said was around education and young people and latterly helping adults to grow and develop as professionals, as teachers, as leaders in education themselves. And I've been fortunate and privileged enough to be able to support both young people and adults. Ironically, my first role, as I say, it almost happened. I wasn't looking for Islamic faith schools. Remember, in the mid-90s in Scotland, there was no such thing. Yeah. And even today, there's very few Islamic faith schools in Scotland, only 2 or 3 or 4 in Glasgow.
Right.
So I stumbled across an Islamic faith school, which happened to be Brondesbury College for boys, as I was looking to become an English teacher. Right. And the concept of Islamic faith schools being alien to me at that time, when I came down, I went through the interview process, came across this man called Yusuf Islam,
yes,
who was setting up a boys' college or a boys' school to complement his primary school and girls' school. And so that's where the whole concept of Islamic faith schools was opened up to me. I started working there. I spent a few years. There was a small team of 3 of us that helped establish that school myself. We had a head teacher. Of course, I was a very young teacher then, and also an administrator. And I actually lived in the school as well. So there's a bit of a tradition of there's a bit of an old school of Muslim faith school teachers who have actually lived in schools as they have helped establish them, and that tradition kind of goes back 30 odd years. So I did that. I helped establish. That was my first school, and then I moved on from there. And in the intervening 30 odd years, as I say, I've worked in and out of Islamic faith schools. So sometimes for local authorities and state schools, different parts of the country or abroad, and then periods at a time in the Islamic faith schools movement as well.
Okay, so that's quite a rich, I guess, a rich understanding you have of the Islamic school dynamic in the UK, because clearly you've been involved in many of them, help setting them up or training the teachers, and developing the curriculums and whatever other consultancy you've done. What have you seen in terms of the change over the years I mean, recently the census data has come out. Over the last 10 years, we've seen a huge increase in Muslims in this country, which begs the question of whether there needs to be more Muslim schools. But also makes me reflect on the previous 10 years. What were the state of some of those Muslim schools, and have there been any changes that have come along the ways? And I think your rich history in that could give us a good understanding, inshallah.
Excuse me. Well, I mean, it's a very involved question that could take quite some time sort of cover. But over the sort of intervening 20 odd years, there has been some positive news around Islamic faith schools, and there's also some not so positive news in the sense of how far have we come, how far have we progressed.
Yeah.
And these are contextual, of course, as well. So I've already alluded to the fact that when I started to train as a professionally qualified teacher, there were no other, or there were very, very few other qualified Muslim teachers. So as a minority ethnic group, this was a profession that we weren't very well engaged with. And you've already said also that today there are huge swathes of Muslim teachers, but many of them work in state schools. So that's been one shift in terms of, as a society, as a Muslim diaspora, that we see many more Muslims engaged with the world of education as professionals.
Yeah.
In terms of the numbers of faith schools, again, in the intervening years, yes, there has been a great burgeoning of Islamic faith schools. My understanding, my last sort of sense check of Muslim faith schools has been that they haven't really been growing as such over the past decade or so, to the same extent that they were maybe 15 to 20 odd years ago. So there was a boom, there was an explosion, if you like, a boom time for Islamic faith schools movement, where they grew quite rapidly, and they grew up to about 180 odd.
Right.
This is going back a few years. But that trend hasn't continued. Again, I was involved, I have been involved with Muslim faith schools at a national level as well, through the Association of Muslim Faith Schools for a short period.
Yeah.
So currently there are still under 200 odd schools. So as a movement, the number hasn't grown, but yet the population has.
Yeah.
My last check on the data of Muslim students, which probably goes back now 3 or 4 years, because I haven't been involved with the sector at a national level so much, is that the Muslim student population is about 5 or 6%. But yet those 180 to 200 Islamic faith schools only represent something like 0.05 of that student population.
Yeah, yeah.
And so now that this new data is out, I'm sure those stats will be updated in terms of, we'll have a bit more up-to-date data in terms of what the Muslim student population is. So is the Muslim community at large serving Muslim students in terms of meeting their needs or having that provision there? And so the short answer to that would be no, on a very simple sense of data.
Sure.
In terms of within the maintained sector, how many Islamic faith schools are there, i.e. have we pulled any traction as a community on developing Islamic state-funded schools? Unfortunately, the data is even weaker. There is less than 20 odd state-funded Islamic faith schools of any type, whether that's a free school, a voluntary aided school, or an old GM school, or an academy, etc., any type of flora or fauna of state-funded school, there is less than a score of them across the whole of the UK. So that's the state of play of the Muslim community at large, having the provision in place. That's quite a different question from, is the Muslim community serving the needs of those Muslim students?
Yes.
I'd probably argue the answer to that is also no.
Okay. Okay. Which I guess, you mentioning about state-funded Islamic schools, brings us to Barnet Hill Academy. So for many years, Barnet Hill has been independent, a fee-paying school, and it's getting the opportunity, as has been going out on Barnet Hill social media and WhatsApp groups and things like this, that there's an opportunity for children who are joining for reception next year from September 2023 to come into Barnet Hill Academy with no fees, with parents not having to pay any fees, and this being a voluntary aid status for that two-form entry reception class. Why is that so important, would you say, that this shift happens between it being independent and it now getting that VA status?
Well, it comes back to the earlier question as to how does the Muslim community serve the needs of Muslim children? So as I've said, in some respects, I'm sure there will be some people that will disagree, of course, but in some respects, the Muslim schools movement has stood still. It's stagnated. If we were to meet the needs of that 5 or 6% of all of the students in the UK, the 5 or 6% that are Muslim, 180, 200 odd Muslim faith schools obviously can't meet those needs. There's just insufficient places, and so one way that you can start to deliver more effectively is to have more state-maintained education. Our parents, broadly across the UK, are unable to manage to afford to pay the fees for independent schools. The average independent school fee across the UK is approximately 17,000.
Wow.
An independent school, any independent school. That's the average.
Sure.
For Islamic faith schools, the average is much less than half that.
Okay.
So for those 180 odd, there are schools across the UK that charge just over £1,000, £2,000, and the most expensive probably charge something in the region of £7,000 to £8,000.
Okay.
So across the UK, with the proportion of schools that serve Muslim students, those fees don't stretch to even what the average is for a non-Muslim independent school. And we know this because we know what our community, what the stretch and the means of our community is. And by no way should the 12% of Muslims who represent, the population of the UK be expected to pay, independent school fees for an Islamic faith education. Why should they? Yeah. By and large, one hopes, one prays that the vast majority of them are taxpayers. And if they are, then of course they should be entitled to have the ability to select to send their child to a school which meets their children's needs with respect to their not only their faith and their religion and their spiritual orientation, but also in terms of their identity.
Yes.
In terms of their well-being, of who they are, and of young people who need to find their way in the world. And I think asking and seeking for that equality of provision and for that diversity of school is not such a huge ask for the tax-paying Muslims of this
Yeah.
country.
Yeah. A lot of Muslim parents, it's quite clear in their mind sort of the benefits of having an Islamic school and their children being in an Islamic school. And, I don't think we need to spell it out. Like you said, this Muslim identity, there's having maybe some sort of better understanding with the teachers, with the school system, because it's of the same faith, the same kind of culture. You know what your child is getting into. However, there is always that question in the minds of parents that, is the school going to live up to the standard that should be across all schools, whether they're, faith schools or state schools? We want our children at the end of the day to get a great education. It's amazing that my children maybe will be surrounded by maybe like-minded people and maybe their faith can be strengthened, but are they going to be walking away with a good education? I think this is something that a lot of parents battle with. Even myself and me and my wife have this discussion. Are the Islamic schools really good enough? And are we sacrificing maybe a portion of our children's education by sending them there? So I'm sure you may have some strong opinions on that. And obviously, you don't need to choose a particular school to make a case study out of, but anything in general that may alleviate some of those concerns for parents.
Well, strong views indeed. Let me ask you the question. What sense of bigotry is it towards Muslim professionals and Muslim schools that leads to that thinking? You had that debate in your home.
Yeah.
So tell me, which bigotry has led to that thinking?
That's a very good point. It could be that we don't think that our own Muslim teachers have worked hard enough, maybe for their positions. Maybe that there's some sort of deep-seated thing in there. Maybe we feel like we're not, as a Muslim culture, you go to maybe certain Muslim organizations, whether it's any sort of organization, a charity, a mosque, or a da'wah organization. Maybe they're not following certain regulations, and you feel like that spills over into Islamic schools as well. It's a good question. I haven't thought about it.
So what is your evidence base for those presumptions?
With this, there probably is no evidence.
Have you done any analysis on that?
No.
Have you analysed those Islamic faith schools?
No.
Have you done a survey?
No.
Anecdotal evidence, just because your friend said? Or is it because of a colonial mindset?
It's a very good point.
We're not good enough.
Yeah.
Do you happen to know how many, excuse the ego, but do you happen to know how many letters I have after my name? Do you happen to know which journals I've published papers in?
No.
Okay. Do you happen to know how many years I've spent at the best, globally, the best institute in the world, undertaking postgraduate research?
No. I think these are all just assumptions.
So, and I'm talking about myself as one person. There's many,
of course,
fantastic Muslim school leaders.
Mm.
Do you know who happens to be the DFE's go-to person for helping state schools at this moment in time?
No idea.
Did you know that was a Muslim?
Oh, that's very impressive. It's really good to know, actually.
You may have heard of Mufti Hamid Patel, who runs some of the best schools in the country. Data, in terms of data. So there's a huge amount of really positive work that Muslim professionals in the education community are undertaking. Unfortunately, the stigma of 20 years ago still begets that profession. And it is stigma,
yes,
and it is bigotry, and it is very much what I would say and what I would challenge to be a backwards mentality and a way of thinking, an interpretation and view that everything white and non-Muslim is superior to everything black and Muslim.
Yes,
and I'm sorry to put it in such frank fashion, but after having spent 30 years working on both sides of the coin, as it were, working within the non-Muslim sector for local authorities, and working within the Muslim community, I really don't see where that kind of thinking in the 21st century still comes from. Maybe there was a degree of validity when, as I say, 20, 30 years ago, I was training to be a teacher, and we had very few Muslim teachers working in Muslim faith schools.
Yeah.
We have challenges within the education sector. I don't know if you know how many, what one of the biggest challenges is in leadership in education at this moment in time, especially with respect to the BAME community.
Yeah.
There is a real lack of BAME head teachers in the UK. And I'm not just talking about Muslims, but of course, a large number of Muslims would fall under that as well. So when we have these ceilings societally, of course it's going to prove much more difficult that we have challenges societally within education as well, i.e. the lack of BAME head teachers, the lack of BAME professionals in senior leadership positions. I spent almost 10 years working for a local authority as an ICT advisor. And when I would go to, this is going back a few years now, but when I would go to conferences and leadership events, there were very, very few BAME, let alone Muslims who were represented at those events. So those are some of the challenges that are within the profession.
Yeah.
And so there is a trajectory that has happened. And whilst you may be right about some of your thinking, what I say, my general advice is that thinking is about 2 decades old.
Yeah.
So really our community at large, if we are to progress, we have to get much more up to speed. One of the positives I see, I think, with respect to your earlier question also, within the Muslim faith schools movement, is because there's been so many people now who are going through the profession, much more of them are much, much better qualified.
Yeah.
Many more of them are into leadership positions, much more skilled and definitely holding their own.
Yeah.
The challenge we have is some of it to an extent is economically. Our community at large is unable to manage to sustain £15,000, £20,000 a year fees. As a community at large, we simply cannot sustain that. Only a small segment can, as with any community pretty much. And so the reason for moving some of our schools into the maintained sector is to take the 150 to 200 students I have currently and to provide them with an education that they pay for. Our families pay for education 2-3 times over. They are taxpayers, 1. Then they pay independent school fees, 2. And then they have to pay for any additional quality of education that they want. For example, a madrasa, or swimming lessons, or lunches, or any other provision educationally that they want. So our Muslim families pay not once, but they pay twice. They pay 3 times. And when our Muslim families, many of whom have got more, are not single child families, are doing that, that's a huge amount to sacrifice. And we cannot sustain that as a community. So it's more important that our communities get behind Muslim faith schools, leave the colonial thinking. I'm sorry to sort of, convey that, but I think we really have to move beyond that. Find out what's happening in those schools and support them.
Yes.
Rather than denigrate them or pull them back by this kind of awkward thinking around what's happening in those schools. And then also help to push them forward and to make them state-maintained schools, because the greater numbers that we have, then the more we can fulfill the needs and aspirations of those young people as Muslims.
Okay, Jazakallah khair. That's I think a very clear message that a lot of people and a lot of parents do need to hear. And I think coming from yourself, I think it holds a lot of weight. But it does lead to then another question about pushing Islamic schools to having sort of the state funding is, then how much control do we have over our Islamic schools, over what is being taught, over how much do we have to bend towards any changes within the national curriculum, changes within the government's vision for education that may or may not be at odds with our own community's vision for our Muslim children?
So again, this is a very simple answer, and I understand where it comes from. I understand where the question comes from. It comes from parents at large not knowing how the system works.
Yeah.
And that's something, again, there has been on and off a bit of a push for the Muslim community to become engaged with governance in schools. That would be a good way to develop our understanding and our knowledge of the system. It's very difficult when you're outside of the system to engage with the system. So becoming involved as governors would help to educate our Muslim communities more about these kinds of questions. Becoming involved with your local Islamic faith school, or developing one, or opening one, or supporting those that are wishing to become state-maintained would help parents at large understand. The simple answer is, if you're saying that entering the maintained sector makes a school become more un-Islamic, then again I would say there's a huge deal of assumption there.
Right. Okay.
And the assumption is, if we make it very visceral, what you're saying is that I'm leading a school into a state sector, and by doing that all of my 30 years of experience in and out of Muslim faith schools, I'm denigrating by making it less Islamic. I would ask you, my friend, why on earth would I do that?
It's a very good question.
What assumption is it in parents' minds that thinks that people like me, many other really great Muslim head teachers, why on earth would we do that?
Yeah.
That's not to say that there isn't a small potential for that to happen.
Right.
Okay. But does that small potential counter the narrative of the lack of provision for 5 or 6 or 7, I don't know what the new figures will tell us, maybe 10% of students in the UK? If our Muslim population has gone up by 22% over the last decade, then surely the numbers of Muslim students will have gone up. And I know that they are one of the fastest growing groups also.
Yes.
So if currently the figures, my data, as I say, is a few years old, if 7, 8, 10% of the student population in England and Wales is 10%, then that small risk that you're talking about, surely is it not worth it to take that small risk and to mitigate it? Even if there is a risk, how are we going to mitigate the risk? It's by parents, as I said earlier, and the community at large becoming involved with governance, becoming more involved with education, and becoming engaged with the Muslim schools movement.
Yeah.
And of course, I am an advocate of that movement. In terms of a very granular level, this school, Barnet Hill Academy, is moving towards becoming a voluntary aided maintained school. And what a lot of people at large, not just Muslims, don't understand is what the term voluntary aided means. So schools in the UK, in England, were established by the church. Okay. It was the church that created schools in the United Kingdom.
Okay.
And it was the church that supported the development of the schools movement for hundreds of years.
Okay.
It was only much later that we had what we call community schools, i.e. state-funded schools. But until, from the origins, it was the church. And voluntary aided schools are schools that are purely designated for a faith tradition.
Yes.
Originally the church, and almost all church schools, until very recently we had the academies system and so on and so forth, so they've been renamed. But more or less all church schools would have been voluntary aided schools.
Yeah.
And faith schools, predominantly by and large, become voluntary aided schools.
I see.
Especially for those communities that are that are not from the church tradition. So, for example, Jewish schools, Muslim schools. And what the voluntary aided system allows you to do is to maintain your school ethos.
I see. Okay.
So your ethos, your Islamic or other faith ethos remains intact. And so the type of school that you convert to, i.e. a VA, allows you to maintain your faith ethos.
Yes.
The state does not intervene with respect to, for example, your admissions criteria.
Yeah.
The bigger challenge that many parents have is actually around RSE. And we can maybe sort of talk about that a little bit. But in terms of RSE, that is incumbent upon every school, whether that is an independent school, a faith school, a community school, or any other type of school. So no school can avoid teaching RSE, but what schools are at liberty to do is to teach it with respect to their own approach. They can determine their own approach, how they teach it. So that's where the bigger challenges are. But in terms of converting to a specific type of school, a voluntary aided school, as I say, comes from the church tradition. They are based solely around faith, and one is allowed to maintain the faith ethos of the school if you convert to that type of school. There's much more detail behind this, but it's for another day.
Okay, inshallah. And I think we're coming up for, I think Maghrib has just hit in where we are now. I think this is a good place to leave it off, to be honest, because I think I could probably do this with you again and get into some of the more details, get into RSE. And actually, I am looking to do an episode on RSE, maybe with yourself and some others as well that have been very vocal about these things. And I think it's obviously good for parents to be educated on it. So, Sheikh Alim, Jazakallah khair for your time. I really appreciate that. And in terms of Barnet Hill Academy, for those of you who weren't paying attention, they are taking in applications at the moment if your children are going to be joining reception in 2023. So if you live anywhere in London, really, you can apply. So make sure you do get your applications in. And I think when we should, hopefully I'll include the links to where people can find that in the description of wherever people are listening to this, inshallah. Jazakallah khair, Sheikh Alim. If you have any last words, go ahead.
No, thank you so much for having me on the show. It's been a real pleasure. And hopefully your audience benefits from some of the discussion, inshallah.
Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.